Welcome, true believers and newcomers alike. Spider-Man co-creator Stan Lee here. Once again, we find our hero Peter Parker, better known around the world as the Amazing Spider-Man, in a heap of trouble. But this is just the beginning, Spidey fans. So get ready for a true superhero action thriller, packed to the brim with thrills and chills, twists and turns. Our mild-mannered, highly intelligent, sometimes neurotic hero of the game, Peter Parker's alter ego, the Amazing Spider-Man. Spidey's wall-crawling and web-slinging, combined with his super strength and amazing agility, make old Webhead one of the most spectacular superheroes around.
The following program contains mature language and spoilers. Listener discretion advised.
Fantastic Four. Spider-Man, Iron Man, Spider-Woman.
I want to talk about some of the superheroes that you're working with now with Marvel Comics, because when I was a kid, there was Captain Marvel and Superman and Batman and Green Lantern. Those people were all perfect.
Well, they were perfect in the sense of the characters they were portraying, but we tried to bring comics a little more into the real world. You know, I shouldn't really say this, but the chances are that possibly even you and I aren't perfect. I wouldn't say that about Marina.
Marina's perfect.
And I know she is. But today, most people just aren't. We tried to make our characters have feet of clay. Now, poor Spider-Man. I mean, okay, he's pretty good at catching bad guys, but he's apt to get an allergy attack while he's fighting. He worries about dandruff. He'll have an ingrown toenail, tears his costume. His Aunt May won't let him go out to save the world because he's not wearing his galoshes and it's snowing out. And the funny thing is, I started doing that as a gag and really to keep myself awake, you know. And I found that the readers are as crazy as I am. They started enjoying this sort of thing. So after 20 years of writing pap and writing things like the strips you mentioned before, I suddenly realized, gee, I could actually have fun with what I'm doing. And now, the more realistic we make our characters, the more the college kids who read them think that it's satire, which has taught me a very great lesson. The world is so crazy that if you present things the way they really are, it comes across as broad satire. And
Oh, wait a minute, no.
all the sociology and psychology majors can do what they want with that one.
But the Spider-Man is not really the way things are.
Oh, he is. You see,
wait till Hunter Thompson gets out here.
he's not the way. No. Spider-Man actually, look, you know Woody Allen. I mean, you know he's for real. Well, I always thought if Woody Allen were a superhero, he'd be Spider-Man, you see? And, or if I were a superhero, because nothing ever turns out right for me. I mean, I got here, for instance, tonight. I got here 4 hours too early. They didn't serve dinner in my... I thought I'd stay in the room and not get in trouble or anything. They didn't serve dinner till 5 minutes before the fella called and says, you got to be here in 5 minutes. So I just had time to take one mouthful of something and race over here so I could wait for an hour backstage, you see?
Right.
And this is what would happen to Spider-Man or to Woody Allen. It's real.
What? No, Spider-Man would fly over, wouldn't he?
How do you think I got here?
How does Spider-Man fly?
Don't you laugh. I'm going to sing next.
How does Spider-Man fly? Spider-Man fascinates me, and then there's more of your characters I want to talk about.
Our books at Marvel Comics, if I may say that, because people may have forgotten, our books at Marvel Comics...
I've said it twice already, and once in introducing your books where?
Every couple of minutes, you promised.
Okay.
We try to be very scientific and very accurate about everything we do. Now, for example, I can't have Spider-Man flying through the air like certain other guys who wear capes and big letters on their chest. So I wanted to be scientific about it. So he shoots webbing out from a little wrist thing he has, and he can shoot at any distance. There could be a building a mile away. Somehow it hits the building, sticks to the building. He swings on it like Tarzan. Perfectly scientific and logical. And that's why our books are beloved by science students and professors and the like.
Hey everybody, welcome to Marvel Superheroes Podcast. I'm Legal Machine. With me is
Yeah, Frank.
and
Mr. Fix-It.
and today we're going to talk about Stanley Lieber.
Well, and Spider-Man.
Well, it's-
Spider-Man.
Spider-Man does whatever a spider can. Spins his web, something.
Any size. Catches thieves just like flies. Watch out. Here comes Spider-Man.
Yeah.
Go web.
Okay, what are we talking about, guys?
Being a bunch of lazy assholes in the 21st century, rather than actually trying to find a copy of Amazing Fantasy 15, we watched a YouTube video. There's a quote-unquote motion comic, which was bullshit, because all they did was show panels and move
read the
panels
comic.
around and read some of the comic. This Nathan dude that did it was clearly a Bendis fan because he wouldn't read any of the fucking captions, even though that offers color
Wow.
and gives you a little bit of background detail.
Shout out.
Because I'm trying to. So he's moving the panels around. I'm trying to read the captions since he's not doing it while keeping up with the flow of it. And of course, he also did some shitty, modern day computer recolored version where they bleached out the thickness so bad that you lost a whole ton of lines. You could totally tell.
Yeah, it looked like computer colored or something.
Yeah, I didn't care for that. But I did appreciate not having to actually read, and I did appreciate that I didn't have to go and hunt down a copy of the story, because I don't think I own a copy of Amazing Fantasy 15, even though there's been a ton of reprints. I'm not even 100% sure that I ever read the story before. I've seen so many retellings of that story. Marvel Saga, where they're taking clips from it and showing me a little piece of it, but I don't remember ever actually sitting down and reading every single panel of that comic book that we saw. Have you guys ever actually read Amazing
I got a story
Fantasy
for this.
15?
I got a story for
Go
this.
ahead.
So when I was young, I want to say maybe 13, 14, I was invited to a birthday party to a friend. We go to the birthday party. It's a Spider-Man themed birthday party. Spider-Man cake, Spider-Man little hats we put on, Spider-Man balloons. Everything's cool. The mom was giving away the little goodie bags with candy, Spider-Man on there. Each of them had this comic book, but a miniature version of it.
Cool.
And I still have it to this day because I thought it's going to be worth a lot of money because she kept telling us, I bought all these I was 15, dude.
Part of the problem.
But I remember, I still have it because it was just so cool to have a miniature version because I could take this comic book everywhere with me compared to the
And if
regular
you did,
size
then
books.
it definitely wasn't worth anything.
Yeah, I read it. I must have read it like 4 or 5 different times because it fits so perfectly in a folder. It wouldn't get bent up. And so, yeah, that's about as close. I've read it
cool.
several times, but I still have it like in a bag and board in my collection.
I think the
somewhere.
only one of those little mini comics I've still got is the one where Captain America was trying to be run as a president that John Byrne did with Roger Stern. I bought that as an adult. I didn't have it as a kid.
Oh, I had this. as a
What about
kid.
you, Mac?
I've got to have this somewhere. It had to be a backup in a fucking 30th anniversary
Spider-Man, the legend.
holographic cover, and then the last 6 pages of reprinting Amazing
I
Fantasy
don't know how
15.
long the
I've got
story is. It's more than 6 pages, though.
whatever.
I think it's probably like a 16 page or something like that.
Wait, 16? Really?
I think, well, based on the video we were watching, it had 2 parts at least, or maybe 3 parts.
Man.
Okay,
doesn't
so
matter.
do you remember when you were introduced to Spider-Man?
Yeah, cartoon.
Okay, you were introduced to the cartoons,
Yeah,
the Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, or the 60s
The
cartoon?
60s cartoon.
Okay, because they used to run that on 39. In the
Actually, if I remember correctly, I think I saw him on what was that? The Electric
Electric Company. Sure,
Company.
yeah,
I remember seeing
that.
him pop up on that because I was like, "Oh shit, Spider-Man's real!" Because I remember seeing him on that, but he didn't web sling or anything. If I remember correctly.
No, he was very. I mean, he crouched.
He kind of mimed a lot of shit. If I remember
miming
correctly.
and crouching. Yeah,
But I think that's like the first time I remember seeing him,
and
and
you
then
remember Easy Reader too, right?
vaguely, dude. Like
Morgan Freeman.
that's right.
Morgan Freeman
Dude,
narrated those.
And again, I only
some of
watched.
them.
They came on what PBS? didn't
PBS,
they?
yeah.
Yeah, they would come.
because it was always Sesame Street and then Electric Company.
Yeah.
because they were kind of like working their way up to the age, because you like.
I just remember as a kid, my mom would drop us off at my grandmother's house because she had to go to work super early and we didn't have to go to school yet. So we would turn on PBS right away and watch cartoons until we had to walk to school, which with no supervision. I was a fucking elementary kid walking to school, and we watched. And I remember the electric company would come on, and I would see Spider-Man. I was like,
he's real.
yeah, I was like, yeah, it's so cool. Just see Spider-Man in the morning. So that's about it for me.
You remember your introduction?
I don't remember my introduction to Spider-Man. I remember my first vivid Spider-Man memory.
Okay.
We were at a restaurant called the Magic Time Machine in El Paso, Texas. And it was very much Jackrabbit Slims from
Okay.
Pulp Fiction, where each section of the restaurant was like a different theme. So you had, but it was even like pop culture. And our waiter was Spider-Man. And
Oh, that's cool.
and I got him to. I had a Trapper Keeper. Google it, kids. I had a Trapper Keeper, and Spider-Man signed my Trapper Keeper, and I was showing people at school the next day that Spider-Man signed my Trapper Keeper. So Joe Schmo waiter, who probably died of a drug overdose, or was definitely a racist and was probably sexually harassing his coworkers in the kitchen, I looked up to as the real Spider-Man, and he was our waiter in El Paso, Texas, in the late '80s. And he signed my Trapper Keeper. So I've always had a fondness for Spider-Man because of that.
Okay, but in media or...
Man, I don't remember. It's got to be Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, and then, of course, the memes.
Well, that's kind of a big leap from Spider-Man is Amazing Friend to the memes.
Well, I had the waiter in the late 80s.
Oh, in the middle. Okay.
And then the memes.
Okay. Spider-Man's another one of the primordials. There was no point in my life that I remember there not being a Spider-Man around. He was in the newspaper strip. I've only done like 2 episodes so far, but I have this comic reader resume thing where I'm trying to go through my experiences with comics chronologically. And I didn't realize, and it's a section I'll have to go back on, I had a ton of free comics. There were giveaways in like newspapers. And Mr. Fiction here may remember this. 7-Eleven did one that had the Enchantress and Peace Pot Pete and the Wizard, Spider-Man, Spider-Woman, Captain America, Incredible Hulk, where they're all having a team up and somehow it involves like Slurpees at the 7-Eleven.
Don't rope me in your old stuff, old man. I don't know what you're talking about.
You don't know what I'm talking about? Okay. But they're always like free comics. There was one that was based at Foley's. I think it was Spider-Man and Cap.
Well, I remember reading Spider-Man a lot in the
Foley's is Mason,
regular newspaper in the Sunday Funnies.
The comic strip, sure.
They would have, and I always hated it because it didn't match the comics.
Right.
I don't know. Did they even finish stories? Like
it
was just like
endless soap opera type thing. Yeah, there were stories.
Like Jack didn't draw those, right? Or
John Amita Sr. drew them for a while there. A bunch of different people have done them. Larry Lieber, his brother, usually writes them these days. Did write them for a long time there. Obviously, the comics. Some of the earliest comics I ever got were Spider-Man comics. After my grandmother died, we were going through her things, and I found a John Romita Spider-Man featuring the Prowler. I think it was issue 90, somewhere in the 90s. And so that shows me that my uncle was probably a Spider-Man fan as well, although he didn't have a lot of those to pass down to me. TV, of course, the Nicholas Hammond live-action movies. There was actually an hour-long TV show, but they would group them together into 2-hour movies, and they'd run on 26 on the weekends. Both the cartoons, 60s and 80s. And also there was one that was just called Spider-Man that would run in syndication, too. Yeah, Spider-Man was just always there. And when in my earliest days as a kid, he was one of my favorites. I think, I kind of graduated past Batman and Superman fairly early on because I would buy their comics and they were always so much lamer because this was, late 70s, early 80s. The comic books, the DC comics of that time period were not great, especially by comparison to Marvel. And so the Spider-Man stuff was just way more engaging. And he was probably one of my first favorite heroes where it was actually sustained for a long period of time, and I enjoyed him in media, enjoyed him in the cartoons. It took me a long time to kind of get past my Spider-Man phase. But do you remember the first comic book you ever bought?
Well, I've told my story, and it was the Return to Sinister Six was the first complete. I had all 6 parts, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, because they were numbered on the front, and I would spend.
And you said that was Eric Larson, right?
Yeah, I would spend my allowance money / money I got. Yeah, I would spend allowance money once every couple of weeks because they had them up on the display, back behind the counter. It was the wooden shelf, the thin wooden shelf where you could prop books up, and they had 1, 2, and every week I would come take another one. And it would only have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and I'd get part 2. You only have 3, 4, 5, 6, and I knew I was the one taking them.
So you weren't getting them as they were coming out; you were getting them.
No, they hadn't been out terribly long though. Yeah. But
this was before you got into Iron Man because that was a David Michelini. So I'm wondering if he gave you your taste for that Michelini flavor. Storytelling.
Yeah, it was probably before I was really into Iron Man comics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And do you remember your first Spider-Man comic?
Spider-Man comic?
Yeah, the one you actually remember going out and buying.
I got some hand-me-downs from my uncle who got me into Hulk. He had a lot of Hulk comics and there was some Spideys in there. But it was those old Spideys.
Spidey?
But it was those old Spideys, the 2-in-1 or 2.
Marvel Team Up?
Yeah, the Marvel Team Up ones. Okay. So I remember that. Do
you remember who he teamed up with in those?
I don't remember. There was a couple of Hulk ones in there. I want to say Spidey.
Do you remember if it was 70s or 80s?
Late 70s, I think.
Late 70s? Okay.
Late 70s. The first Spider-Man comic book I physically bought was, I would have to say, probably... I want to sound cool and say Todd McFarlane, but it wasn't. It was a 2-parter with Hobgoblin and some guy who was dead. Not Carnage, he looks like the Hobgoblin. He kind of floats.
Oh, Jack-o'-lantern?
No. He would touch things and they would die. Basically he would just...
Oh, like Carrion?
Something like that.
Name?
Something
he had wrap around. Yeah. Real pale. I think it's Carrion is his name.
They did a 2-part story where it was one was in Spectacular Spider-Man and one was in Amazing Spider-Man.
Okay.
And I went to Kroger's and I got one. And then when the new Amazing Spider-Man came out, it wasn't there. So I had to run through all the fucking local 7-Elevens and stop and goes to try to find that other part. That was that's the one I distinctly remember buying a 2-parter and wanting to read it because if I remember the cover correctly, it's Hobgoblin and that other villain in a sewer chasing Spider-Man.
Okay.
And I think that's the first one I physically spent money to buy. And then that's when I kind of got into them.
Yeah. But besides those free comics, and another one was when the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo would be in town, and they did a tie-in with that and Foley's. And Foley's was Houston's equivalent of Macy's. Eventually Macy's bought Foley's, and now we only have Macy's here in town. But as far as...
Barely.
Yeah, barely true. As far as ones I bought, it's tough to pinpoint the first ones. I know I used to like Marvel Team Up, and I bought a number of those. I used to buy Marvel Tales, particularly the ones that reprinted the Steve Ditko stuff. And for some reason, I was never as into Amazing Spider-Man. Peter Parker or the Spectacular Spider-Man was kind of my jam. Yeah. Al Milgrom had a run on that, and I used to collect it during that time period because I for some reason, I was really drawn to Al Milgrom stuff when I was a kid. So, Mr. Fix-It, did you ever read the original Spider-Man origin story from Amazing Fantasy 15?
A long time ago. It's been fucking long time since.
And do you recall which presentation it was?
No.
Okay.
Like when we watched it, it was kind of a refresher course for me because it's been so long. Like I said, I had the little miniature comic that I read a bunch of times, but that was so long ago.
Yeah. I really don't feel like we need to recap in any kind of detail the story. I'll just give a few bullet points. Peter Parker, nerd, not liked by his schoolmates. The only people who really love him in the world are his Aunt May and Uncle Ben, and also a lot of his teachers at Midtown. Was it Midtown High that he went to? Gets bit by a radioactive spider, gains the proportionate strength and speed and other abilities of a spider. I'm sorry, I'm thinking of Spider-Man because he didn't have the hyphen back then. You were so like, where's the hyphen? Where's the hyphen? Decides that he's going to use his powers to become a pro wrestler initially, and then eventually become like a TV star to make money for himself and his family, and finally get recognition and respect from people. Fails to stop a burglar who was running out of the TV station. Burglar turns up a while later, shoots his Uncle Ben in a burglary. Spider-Man confronts him. The burglar dies by accident, and Spider-Man realizes that with great power comes great responsibility, and becomes a person who's going to try to help the world using his powers. What do we think of the origin story? Like the original origin story too, or the origin in general?
I think the bare bones of it are great.
I'm sure back then it was revolutionary.
Absolutely, yeah.
At that point.
I think it's one of the best origins of any superhero.
Getting bitten by a radioactive spider?
The whole thing. The O. Henry twist and the setup is great. I do think it's funny, though, and very little recognized, Spider-Man stole from Wonder Woman. Because when Wonder Woman first came to the United States, the first thing that she did, nobody ever remembers this, is she got a gig doing like live presentations of bullets and bracelets. And that's where she made her money to support herself while she was in the States. And then the guy who's promoting her when she decided to quit tried to run off with her money, and she chased him down and got her money back. So Spider-Man borrowed a little bit from Wonder Woman. Nobody ever remembers this shit. But no, it's a great origin story. But the actual story that we saw, the presentation of it, what did you think about the original Stan Lee, Steve Ditko presentation?
I mean, I thought it was good. I don't want to compare it to the thing. I thought it was pretty good. It's kind of bare bones.
Mm-hmm.
It is. Like you were saying that you weren't sure if you ever read it. I don't think I ever read that thing either. But I'm telling you, I feel like I could have recited what happened to him. I mean, I know the exact sequence of events.
It's comic book gospel.
Yeah, just osmosis. I know that whole origin. So kind of watching and reading the panels, it was sort of like, okay. I mean, I guess it's all here. But I don't know. There wasn't like, oh, I forgot about that. That blew me away. It's just sort of, I don't know. I don't know how I feel about it just because it's what happened.
Yeah. I forgot how gung-ho Spider-Man was for the fame and the fortune. Like, yeah, fuck yeah, I'm finally going to get respect and money now. Mr. Fix-It made a point. He was getting picked on.
Okay,
that part. Couldn't get laid.
I agree with that part too. Okay.
Huh?
You're about to say I agree with this.
Well, I was going to let him say it.
Which part?
Well, in the early part of the story, they're making a big show of he's really into science, and he's really into his elderly uncle and aunt. And then when he tries unsuccessfully to hook up with girls and hang out with his school chums,
where I said I was shocked that he wasn't a school shooter?
Yeah, because he's like super repressed.
Well, he's like you'll see one day.
Yeah.
Or something
I'll show you.
I just remember seeing. I remember.
It didn't help too,
I just know when the kid or when the comic book went through that part, and he's doing the dialogue. I was like, I've heard these lines in like the news where they're like, this kid was texting shit like this or putting it on
Facebook post before the shooting
or some shit. I was like, I've heard these words put together in these sentences.
Peter seems such a nice boy, but the signs were there.
Man.
And I was just like,
signs were there.
Well, especially Steve Ditko drew him with like this maniacal grin at one point too, where you're like, oh shit. Yeah, this guy was definitely troubled. And I didn't remember that stuff.
Yeah, I guess you're right. I guess I mean I remembered the exchange he had with the cop, where the cop's like, "Why didn't you stop him? What, you could have tripped him, bumped him, something? You could have slowed him down." And he was just like, "Whoa, dude, look, and he turns it on the cop and goes, "I'm tired of being pushed around. Like, you can't tell me I got to stop that guy." And it was like, that's sort of, and he was like giving it to the cop, like, "You can't tell me what to do. I don't need to stop anybody." You know what I mean? It's like
nobody's pushing me around.
That was
anymore.
I didn't quite remember that. That was yeah. Nobody's pushing me around anymore. Yeah, something.
Yeah, Pete comes off a bit of a dick.
Yeah, he's definitely a pretty big dick in this stories. Also, it's funny too, besides the fact that seeing Spider-Man without the hyphen really fucks you up as a hardcore comic guy.
Weird.
Because it's such a like, you're not a true fan if you don't know the hyphen's supposed to be there. If you write it as one word, you're not a real fan. You're not a true fan. But also, Steve Ditko's still figuring out how to draw a Spider-Man. And that's not a surprising thing because Spider-Man's a tough fucking character to draw. I've tried to draw Spider-Man. I can't do it. It looks, even worse than my normal drawings is trying to draw Spider-Man. And a lot of really good artists struggle to draw Spider-Man. Starlin, for instance. I don't think Starlin can draw Spider-Man worth a shit.
Really?
Hey, Starlin Spider-Man is bad. Lots of people, anybody who draws Spider-Man with a nose is doing it wrong as far as I'm concerned. Looking at that original origin story, wonky fucking Spider-Man. Especially that one panel where he's got the pupils. That's just like, ugh. That just does not look right. And the webs are all kind of fucking askew, and the anatomy is a little wonky because he hasn't started doing the real. Steve Ditko invented an anatomy and invented a locomotion for Spider-Man that's very distinctive. And when it's not there in those early stories, when he's still trying to draw like an actual dude wearing a mask, it doesn't resonate correct. It's you're like phobic about it because you're like, oh, that's not Spider-Man. What are you doing there? So it was weird to me seeing that, and also how simplistic the art was. Because you look at like say the early Doctor Strange stories, for instance, Steve Ditko was already putting a lot more effort into his superhero stuff. Where I think in his early story, since before this he'd been doing all those generic Ookla the monsters showing up, it's very light on detail. It was another thing he was hacking out for the page rate. Everybody looked like Little Orphan Annie and shit. You know, they all had like little dots for eyes, just like a little quick eyebrow, and just not a lot of detail in there.
Yeah, I think you can tell this was early in the. So I'll contrast this to Iron Man's origin, where it was like hyping you on the front page. This is the introduction of another Marvel character from the house that brought you Fantastic Four. Like at that point, they had we know how to introduce a new character. We've got a formula to it. We're going to go all in. Where you can tell probably with Spider-Man, it wasn't quite. They weren't quite there yet.
Yeah.
And once Spider-Man hit, they're like, okay, I can figure out how we can apply this to other characters we come up with now. Because, like I said, like we were saying, that's some of Don Heck's best work ever.
Right.
In Tales of Suspense number 39. They knew what they were doing. We can tell Spider-Man's probably early in the origin game.
Much more of a low investment experiment.
Yeah.
Well,
exactly.
because there's all this lore around Fantastic Four #1 and how Stan wanted to quit the industry and his wife talked him into, well, just do one comic book the way you want to do it.
I've heard that story.
And so he does Fantastic Four, and then Spider-Man was very early. They'd already introduced Ant-Man, but it was in one of the monster stories, so it wasn't really a superhero thing yet. And I don't know if they'd actually started the serial yet by that point. And I'm trying to think of what Thor, I think, was already introduced before Spider-Man. But there weren't a lot of characters before Spider-Man. He was really early on. And it was the first time I think that he got really experimental again after starting the Fantastic Four. And I know Martin Goodman did not want Spider-Man. He did not like the idea of doing a superhero based on spiders. He thought spiders were creepy. It would turn off audiences. And Stan kept pushing to do a Spider-Man story. So he dumped this thing into the last issue of an anthology that didn't sell worth a shit. That they changed the name of because it was Amazing Adult Fantasy for 14 issues, and then one more issue of Amazing Fantasy, and then it's out. And I think it was an instance where, okay, I pushed the boundaries with Fantastic Four. Let me see if I can go even further with it. And it is interesting because you're like the narrator, right? When he's doing the Spider-Man voice, especially as a guy who does a lot of synopsizing of comic books on these podcasts, and I'll try to do like a superhero voice, and it's always much deeper than my voice and much more stiff and burly sounding and shit. One of the nice things about Spider-Man that should have stood very much apart from any other superheroes of that time period is everybody always does Spidey with like a higher pitch voice than their actual voice. They're always playing up the youth. He doesn't sound like any other superhero. And that must have been so revolutionary when he first came out.
I hadn't thought about it until you mentioned it just right now. I mean, for God's sake, Christian Bale's Batman was inaudible.
Right.
He was growling so much. Whereas with Spider-Man, it goes up because he's a snarky kid. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, interesting. I never thought about that.
And he's a skinny little guy, and even when he's in the Spider-Man costume, he really doesn't muscle up that much. He's still pretty much a skinny little guy the whole time. Just being a kid and not having an adult mentor leading him, being an orphan that still has guardians, just so many different things where it's like something you've never seen before. He is a real fucking punk too. You respect him because they make a point of telling you, look, he's a smart guy, he's a good student, But obviously the people he hangs out with can't stand him. And you have to figure there's probably some personality defects, probably because he can't talk about anything that anybody's interested in. He's angry and kind of weaselly right off the bat. He wasn't an aspirational figure the way he's presented in the story. You definitely get a sense of this being like an anthology story where they're willing to have a less likable, weirder guy be the lead because they're not expecting to do a second issue necessarily. They took some chances with this guy that they didn't take in the past. One thing that I thought was interesting is Steve Ditko was an objectivist. He was a fan of Ayn Rand. And there was a strong ideological conflict between liberal Stan Lee and objectivist Steve Ditko about the direction of the book. Because these were both... This Spider-Man very quickly became the #1 Marvel book. And that's why as early as the late 60s, they were already doing a cartoon show. The big sticking point, my understanding, is that they were going to reveal the secret identity of Spider-Man's arch foe, the Green Goblin. And Stan Lee insisted on having it be a character from the supporting cast because he wanted that personal connection between Peter and whoever his arch enemy was. Steve Ditko insisted that was too much of a coincidence. It didn't make sense. It should be a completely unknown character to him rather than somebody in his circles. And I think he specifically objected to it being Norman Osborn because Norman Osborn is very much a John Galt type figure. He's an industrialist, sort of a self-made man who's very accomplished and a steward of industry and all this kind of shit. And that's something that Steve Ditko obviously revered because if you look at his Charlton work, when he decides he's going to make his new version of Spider-Man, he goes off and does the revised Blue Beetle, where that's exactly, he's the Norman Osborn. He is also an industrialist. He's an inventor. He's a self-made man. He doesn't have any superpowers. It's all the things that he creates with his mind. And it's funny to me because when you're looking at this origin story, you could see where right off the bat, I don't know how much of an objectivist Steve Ditko was when the character was actually created. But when you're reading the story, one of the things that's very notable about that mindset is the sense that you don't owe anybody else anything. That if you have a talent, you can exploit that talent to the best of your ability. You reap the benefits that talent awards you, and you don't have to worry about anybody else. You don't have any obligation. And at the midpoint of the Spider-Man origin story, he's like, wow, I've got these Spider-Man powers. I've already shown that I can beat up a wrestler, and so I'm a fucking physical dynamo. I've got all these cool powers. I'm now going to be rich and famous, and I'm going to make a ton of money, and the only people I want to take care of are my aunt and uncle because they're the only people who cared for me, and I love them, and because I love them, I'm going to take care of them and fuck everybody else. I'm in it for the money. Give me the Benjamins. And I noticed at that point in the story, it's like, wow, this guy, he's in the right Rand place. You know, this is a Steve Ditko character right now. This is a guy who, you know, Steve also was kind of pudgy and he had his little hornwind rim glasses, and he was probably an intellectual guy based on the letters I've seen him write, the weird manifestos he's come up with over the years. He was definitely a thinker. Definitely somebody who had confidence in his talents, his artistic talents. And so you could see where he would probably identify with Peter Parker. And in that moment, that's like the randiest moment that Spider-Man ever has. And then by the end of the issue, you see that he shirked his responsibility to his fellow man by allowing the thief to escape. That hurts him individually. It hurts society on the macro level because you let this criminal get away to do bad stuff to other people. But then it also strikes him in the micro level where it's his uncle that gets killed by this burglar. And he suddenly recognizes that his powers gives him an obligation to society. And so at the end, he has this refutation of his ideology from the midpoint of the story where he recognizes that was the wrong path that he was on, that he's faced enormous personal consequence of that shirking of his responsibility. And then he spends the rest of his superhero career devoted to preventing that from ever happening to anybody else. Recognizing that when he doesn't stop the burglar here, then they could go on to kill somebody else's Uncle Ben. Yep. And he doesn't want to, he feels a responsibility to all of society to use his powers to stop that from happening to anybody else, which is the exact opposite of objectivism and a complete repudiation of the philosophy of Steve Ditko, which would eventually, I think, lead him to go create Blue Beetle instead. And all the other Randian characters that were at Charlton, like The Question. He's really Randian, but he's definitely of a conservative bent, but Captain Atom also. So it's bizarre because you don't have Spider-Man without Steve Ditko, but Spider-Man is almost like the personification of the refutation of Steve Ditko's personal philosophy.
Very interesting. And yeah, and you're right. It would be interesting to know what his mindset was in 1962 or whatever it was. When did he take up those beliefs? I don't know. It'd be kind of interesting.
Well, I think he always had conservative leanings because Captain Atom was around, I think, in 58, 59. And those stories were written by Joe Gill, although I don't know what the situation was. It might have been something like with Stan where he would draw the story and somebody else would do the dialogue over it. I don't know. Marvel's style is credited to Stan Lee, so I'm not sure if any other companies did that. I think they were probably working full script. But the Captain Atom stories definitely have a strong conservative bent. They're very pro-military, very pro-authority, very pro-business, very anti-communism. So if Steve was plugging into those stories, there's a good chance that he probably was to the right prior to the Randian bent. And I don't know when, like, the Fountainhead. I think the Fountainhead came out, or probably when did the Fountainhead come out, or when did Rand become a thing?
Oh, I have no idea.
I think they were written in the 50s, but I don't know if they had the impact until later on.
When did Atlas shrug?
Yeah, when did that happen?
I'm not so sure.
I just remember in Dirty Dancing when the underline was put onto the asshole waiter that ends up getting the dancer knocked up and not helping her with the abortion, is when he pulls out a copy of the Fountainhead and gives it to Baby and tells her she needs to read this. And that was like, oh, you know this guy's an asshole. He's got a copy of the Fountainhead. So
That's the tell.
That's the tell.
You could always tell who the asshole is because they're carrying around an Ayn Rand book. Ayn Rand. Sorry, I always call her Ayn Rand.
I still don't know. I've heard both. You know. Yeah. Well, I mean, when Ted Cruz and Paul Reiner get up there and talking about it, it's like, oh, okay, this is bad stuff.
Hey, everybody, we're going political.
Well, just like comics, we've always been political.
Just where do you get off telling me what's right?
You can't just leave her.
I didn't blow a summer hauling toasted bagels just to bail out some little chick who probably boil every guy in the place. A little precision, please, baby. Some people count. Some people don't. Read it. I think it's a book you'll enjoy, but make sure you return it. I have notes in the margin.
You make me sick. Stay away from me. Stay away from my sister, or I'll have you fired.
So, anything else about the origin, though? Anything about that story?
It is what it is. I don't know. It's
such a part of comic books that it's hard to like look at it critically because we weren't around when this thing came out. We don't understand what comic books were because so much of comic books that we know today is based around this story and the impact that it had.
Yeah, I mean it's. And also, I mean, but there's also a lot of it that still is pretty unique. Like you said, the fact that he's still a little kid. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? He doesn't turn into this big, bad, strong dude. He's still just a kid in tights. And then I think Aunt May. I mean, Aunt May is another kind of unique to Spider-Man deal.
Even having a parental figure in your comic books,
maybe Alfred,
but Alfred wasn't.
But not really, right?
See, this is the thing, though. Alfred wasn't Alfred yet. Alfred was just the butler for ages. They didn't start playing him as a sort of parentalish figure until the 70s, really.
Yeah, and was in distress and
he was just the guy who pressed the suits and delivered the tuna sandwiches to the Batcave. Yeah, having a living parental figure was unique unto itself.
Well, and that is frail and needs to be taken care of. That he's working jobs to make sure he's got some money for Aunt May.
He has to work a job. Then he's not like already a cop or a reporter or an engineer or something. He's just a high school student.
Yeah. And even then he can't even take what he's good at, science, and make a career out of it. He's got to be a photographer to earn a living.
That happens a while in him too.
Right,
so
but
right now he's still just a poor ass high school student.
Yeah. So I don't know. There's still, as much as Spider-Man influenced, there's still a lot of Spider-Man unique stuff that is just sort of, unique to Spider-Man and Peter Parker.
Yeah. Also, I think the hatred that's directed at him. I mean, it's not just like Clark Kent where it's like, oh, you little bumbling twerp, Mostly it's Lois Lane going, oh, you're a coward and a doofus. I don't want to date you. But everybody else kind of treats Clark okay. But with Peter, it's like everybody who's not an authority figure can't stand him. None of his peers can stand him. They go for panel after panel of people just like, ooh, Peter, get the fuck away from me. I'm sure that was unique to comics at that time. Definitely, I think it's an interesting story for sure. I was certainly more invested in this than most comic books from that time period that I've read. So even though in this case it was read to me, but
this was aged for 1,000 years. And the barrels built from the wreck of Grunho's fleet is not meant for mortal men.
Neither was Omaha Beach, Blondie. Stop trying to scare us. Come on.
All right.
Excelsior.
Well, did you want to do your anecdote before you forgot about it? I can always edit it somewhere else.
Yeah, I don't really know. I didn't read the whole article, but it was just they were talking about how Todd McFarlane basically said. I think the clickbait headline was "Hopes Stan Lee got his one last wish before he passed away" or something like that. And that was, I guess, He went to go see Stan. Todd went to go see Stan recently, and I guess when they were alone, he basically just said that he just wanted to. What was his wife's name?
Joni.
Joni. He said he just wanted to see Joni one last time. He wanted to go see Joni, and he thinks that because of whoever his handlers were hadn't been taking him to go visit her grave or whatever, and he'd been questing it, and they had not been taking him, that he was hoping that he now finally gets to go see her. But that kind of just spoke to. You could tell that Todd was even a little disturbed about the state he was in at the time. Although it did seem like it kind of got better there towards the end. It looked like he kind of resolved some issues, maybe.
I don't think
Whoever
so.
happened to be controlling his Twitter account at the time made us think things were maybe a little bit better.
Yeah.
But yeah, you can even tell somebody like Todd was like, "Ooh, this is a bad situation." And Todd's known him most of his life. You know what I mean? And it's.
Well, did you read that article? I think it was Rolling Stone or Hollywood Reporter. I think it was where they were trying to clear the air. Did y'all read that?
No,
I got the gist of it, but
no. Okay, so basically, the reporter goes out there, and it was arranged by JC. I think is her name. Is his daughter, and his daughter already has a history of elder abuse against both Stan and his wife. I think substance abuse. They keep talking about it. Oh, yeah, it's their daughter here, their kid. It's like their kid is in her 60s, late 60s, if I recall correctly. So it's like her shit's not going to get cleaned up. When you've been fucked up for 70 years, you're not going to get de-fucked up. And of course, there were all those stories that came out about them drawing blood from Stan to put into pins and all. Obviously,
What?
Stan's had tons of fucking bad
You didn't
business
hear
deals.
that?
No, I never heard that
Tell
one.
them about that shit.
Yeah, because weren't they were doing like Stan Lee signed with Stan Lee's blood.
Yeah,
so they
like
actually
the Kiss
brought
blood
someone
thing.
over to
my.
draw his blood to fill up these fucking pins so he could blood sign.
That
them.
is fucking insane.
Literally blood
So,
sucking.
well, I mean, I'm thinking. So I remember Kiss did it for their comic, but they
just mixed a little blood into the ink.
they wanted to do it though.
Yeah,
Like,
they wanted to do it. With Stan, it's like the phlebotomist comes over. He's like, "Oh, you want some blood? Okay." And finds out later on they were making pins out of his fucking blood.
my
Well,
goodness.
actually, what it wasn't technically blood. It's that they used his blood to get his DNA and mixing that into the ink, DNA replication or some shit like that. So yeah,
that's still
disturbing.
fucking horrific.
Yeah. So, and of course, there were also those stories about he was supposed to be sexually harassing his nurses and all this other bullshit. But yeah, the last few years after Joni passed,
He's a I think at the time he was like
He was 94, wasn't he?
92 at the time. No,
Right.
because it wasn't a year ago. It was
okay, it's been, yeah.
I think it was like 92 when that was happening. Can we at least just when you're 92, for the most part, you're I don't think your wits are about you all the time. You're 92. Can we relax about a 92-year-old?
I'm not saying that it's okay at any age to be sexually harassing women.
Nor am I.
But you're considerably less threatening and considerably more easy to handle at 92 than you would be at earlier ages.
True.
At 92, a strong gust of wind can break your hip. Can we please just relax at 92? That was the same thing that happened with Bush. But they were saying, well, Bush was making things. He's in a wheelchair. Like, come on.
Yeah.
I don't want to get on a soapbox here, but
There's an expectation when you work in that environment that things like that will happen. And there are some people that will just laugh it off. And I'm sure everybody knows, oh, yeah, that's a handsy person. But some people will always laugh it off, and some people will always get really, really upset about it. And I'm not sure that the way to fix it is to go after the old fart. I think the way to fix it is maybe just have the people that can tolerate that person deal with that person, the people who can't not, But anyway, point being, Stanley's legacy is always going to be complicated, and we'll get into that. But toward the end there, he didn't look like he was a happy person. He didn't look like he was getting exploited. And if you read the Hollywood Reporter article, you could tell that the person who was doing the reporting was making sure to tell you as many of the weird, creepy, sordid details you would leave out of a normal interview like that, because he wanted you to know this shit was going on. But it was clear that Stan wanted to clear the air to give his daughter one more shot at, doing something and not being looked upon as the evil Satan child or whatever. Yeah. He clearly wanted to clear her name and give her one last shot at doing okay with him gone. I pretty much guarantee you that won't be the case, but he just wanted to leave the earth with her in a decent place, and he knew that his time was just about up. But it was also clear that he was being exploited, that he was being manipulated, that quite possibly he wasn't as worried about that as his daughter was maybe worried about that, and her lawyers and the people who were probably involved in being parasites around this poor guy's life at the end of it. I'm sure they were concerned about looking good at the end there once all the legal battles are going to happen, because there's totally going to be a ton of legal battles.
Oh, yeah.
Because Stan was not a good business person. He never was. He was a good salesman. He was a good glad hander, not a good businessman. just like everybody else from Marvel at that time. And he caught all these fucking deals with all these different people with conflicted interests and a lot of unscrupulous people. There's going to be so many fucking lawsuits over the next few years over his stuff.
You know what it reminds me of, and I think I've told this story on the podcast, before, but it reminds me of Famous Amos from Famous Amos Cookies.
Oh yeah.
And I saw Famous Amos, and I told you guys, like, you know, when I was a kid, like, they would always show us the same video about Famous Amos Cookies. Now, Famous Amos was a self-made man, and look at his famous cookie company. Everybody loves Famous Amos Cookies. And then I'm watching Shark Tank like a year ago, and Famous Amos is on there, and all the Shark Tank people are like, well, like Mark Cuban's like, what? And he's like, hey, I'm not Famous Amos. Wink, wink. Like, I'm still Amos. And they're like, so what happened to Famous Amos? And he was like, well, I'm a terrible businessman. Like, he was just like I'm terrible. And he was like, he basically sold his name, and the company would go into debt, and every single time it would happen, he'd cut a new deal, and every single time his stake in the company would get smaller, 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 until he just had no stake left, including his name. And Famous Amos Cookies owns Famous Amos's name, so now he's out trying to make some new cookie company called, you know...
Semi-famous Amos. Kind of famous.
Famous Steve's or some shit like that. But it's like...
Tremendous...
Notable Jerry, you know?
It's like you assume that this big personality that's the face of a successful company must be really good at business, and you find out, no, they're fucking terrible at it.
Yeah.
Like, they're horrible at it. But, they're so charismatic, you buy into it, but anyway. Continue.
Yeah, well, and I think this is a perfect example, is people really like to tear into Stan Lee because he took a disproportionate amount of credit for the creations, specifically at Marvel. You know, they took credit from Jack Kirby, he took credit from Steve Ditko, yada yada, right? Well, Steve Ditko is a weirdo, an isolated, politically wackadoo kind of dude, very, very weird guy. He didn't want to talk to anybody. He spent most of the latter decades of his life living alone in an apartment somewhere, and then he died quietly earlier this year. There was no people talked about the passing of Steve Ditko, but that happened in June. It was mostly just in comic circles. A few of the people that are associated with comics that know, like Jonathan Ross, made mention of it. But when Stan Lee died, I went into work, and one of the first things my boss tells me is like, "Oh yes, Stan Lee died. Was he on your side or was he on the other side?" And I think she wasn't sure if, like, as a DC Marvel partisan, maybe I wouldn't be mourning. He asked, "Are you mourning him? Were you on his side?"
Were you happy he's gone, or were you mourning him?
And he's like, "Of course I'm mourning Stan. Everybody loves Stan. Thank you for your condolences." And then another coworker is like, "Hey, did you hear about that man? The man?" It's like, Stan the Man Lee? Yes, I heard that he passed on. I'm sorry to hear that. Like, yeah. So this is a thing where the normies know that Stan Lee died.
Oh, yeah. I got text message from people who are not into comics, like, "I'm sorry to hear about Stan Lee." And I'm like, I didn't really know him. But yeah, I heard he passed away. Yeah, I got at least 3 or 4 texts like that through the day. It was really weird.
That's never going to happen again.
True.
There's never going to be a situation where normal people are going to name check a comic creator and be like, "Oh yeah, did you hear so-and-so died?" The best chance is the Image guys.
I was going to say, maybe Todd McFarlane. Maybe one day we'll
Jim Lee.
Did you hear the base? Nobody's going to text. Nobody knows who Jim Lee is.
Yeah, Rob Liefeld, I think, would be a better shot because...
Did you hear the Deadpool guy died?
Yeah,
I can see that. The Spawn guy died.
Say, hey,
maybe the toys probably helped.
Yeah.
So
hey, did you hear the Wildcats guy died?
Oh, that's fucking cold.
The crazy
man.
guy who thinks he's a cat who downstairs.
No, the first guy that sold out all his stuff first.
Oh. But yeah, no, Stan Lee was this great ambassador to comic. And so even though Steve Ditko died earlier this year, hardly anybody took notice.
I didn't even know.
Huh?
I didn't know. I just found out right now.
Yeah, you're a comic book guy.
Really? You didn't know?
No, I didn't know.
Yeah. Wow. Jack Kirby died back in the 90s. A lot of people had an outpouring.
What?
We landed on the moon.
Wait, my legends are vanishing so quickly. When is this happening?
That kind of Wizard magazine. But see, the thing with Jack Kirby, when I was growing up, I remember in the 90s, a few years after Jack Kirby had passed, and Wizard magazine did this big thing like, "Oh, the king is dead," and all these people had this outpouring of love and support. And I was talking to a guy who was more of a Bronze Age guy, a guy who'd grown up on 70s comics, and at that time he was probably 20 years my senior, 15 years my senior, some shit like that. And so we were in the back room of the comic shop, and he very quietly said, "I never liked Jack Kirby. I just, that wasn't our generation." And I said, yeah, because when I was growing up, Jack Kirby comics were the ones you tried to get rid of. It was Commandees and 2001,
fucking
stuff like
Commandee.
that. Yeah, and it was the stuff you got stuck with. It was the stuff that they threw in as ballast on bad trades and stuff. And I didn't enjoy Jack Kirby comics that much when I was a kid. I liked the reprint collections, like when I got the Fireside edition of Captain America: Sentinel of Liberty, and they had the early Kirby reprints. Not early Kirby, it's actually midlife Kirby, because this was the 1960s retellings of the 1940s Captain America stories. Now, that's stuff that I enjoyed. I liked that Kirby, but I didn't care about the contemporary Kirby of the 70s and 80s when I was growing up. And Steve Ditko was the same way. Steve Ditko was that weird guy who used to work at Marvel, and people loved him when he was at Marvel. And he goes off and does like Stalker and The Creeper and Hawk and Dove and Squirrel Girl. And actually, because remember, Squirrel Girl is a thing now. Squirrel Girl was not a thing in the 90s. That was one of those revival things that happened in the 2000s. Nobody gave a Squirrel Girl was a punchline. She was a joke. They mocked this one-off character that showed up. And Steve Ditko didn't even have the renaissance that Kirby had in the 80s, because at least Kirby was involved with, superpowers, and so his designs were being used for toys, and so he got a little bit of acknowledgement then. But when Jack Kirby died, only a few years right before he died, that he finally started getting people saying they loved him and they supported him, and but Topps did the Kirbyverse, and that stuff didn't sell worth a shit. People lambasted these guys. These guys were the traitors. These were the guys who they formed Marvel back in the 60s, and then they left to DC, and then they fell off into the independents. And people that were, again, partisans, fans of Marvel, fans of DC, were like, those guys are traitors, and those guys are old, and nobody cares about those guys anymore. Throughout the 80s and into the 90s, nobody gave a shit about those dudes. Because Jack Kirby was a terrible businessman. Steve Ditko was a terrible businessman. Steve Ditko had such a negative charisma that there's hardly any pictures of him out there. There aren't a lot of stories about him. You couldn't have a conversation with the guy without triggering him and have him like disappear on you and not want to talk to you. Stop the conversation, just walk off and not talk to you anymore. Jack Kirby is a guy that people do love because they would sit with him and he'd be warm and he'd be very he was encouraging, especially of artistic people. He wanted artistic people to create art and to create their own work, and he was a very loving person. There was tons of people who talked about how Jack and Roz would basically adopt somebody and let them come over to the house and hang out. Random people, like I think Lynn Danzig used to hang out with Jack Kirby, for instance, right?
Wait, what?
Yeah. Random fucking people. So they were good people, salt of the earth people. But Jack Kirby was not a public guy. He was not somebody who was going to go out there and talk to people and sell himself. He would talk to you for a little while, but then he had to go off and create and be left alone for a while. He wasn't somebody who was gregarious or anything. You had to have a guy like Stan Lee act as an ambassador for comics, because these creators, no matter how great they were at drawing and a concept, coming up with these cool ideas that you want to read comic books about, but they could not communicate those ideas to a wide audience because they couldn't write dialogue that rang true. They couldn't present characters that were sympathetic or that were relatable, and they couldn't get out there and actually talk to people and promote the work once it was produced. You had to have a Stan Lee out there to actually sell this stuff. Salesmen get a bad name because they're so involved with the whatever to make the sale, right? That mentality you've got. As long as you're making the sale, they'll lie to you, they'll cheat you, whatever it takes to get that sale. But you need salesmen because if you have something, if you created something, it doesn't matter if you can't get it into people's hands, if they're not using it, if they're not enjoying it. You have to have somebody to promote this stuff. And Stan Lee was a master promoter, and he got shit for it. Jack Kirby created Funky Flashman and Roy Boy, mocking Stan Lee and Roy Thomas, treating Roy Thomas as though he were a lackey and Stan Lee as though he were a snake oil salesman. And that is an aspect of his personality. But without a guy like Stan out there putting dialogue in those characters' mouths that people responded to, without him writing Stan's soapbox and writing the comments and letters column to connect to the audience, without him getting guys like Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko onto books that could sell, that he could show to the public, that would get into college campuses and make comics relevant again after they were almost destroyed as an industry in the 50s after the Wortham issue and just a decline in interest because of things like television. Without Stan, you may not have a comic book industry, because while Stan needed to have Julie Schwartz show him that superheroes could be a thing again and help the Marvel Revolution start, without Stan out there parading, Kirby, I don't think the DC survives, because all DC had was superheroes, which would have died off probably by the end of the 60s, as happened after Batman Mania came and went. It took the relevant comics and the fandom built up by Stan Lee to continue the comic book medium and also create the type of comic books that were more grounded in reality, that spoke to people in modern concerns. You have to have a guy like that out there, and if you don't have the comic industry we have today. You probably don't have a comics industry at all. Without a guy like Stan Lee to inspire the next generation of creators that came up in the 70s and 80s, those guys aren't there to produce the comic books that continue to hook people over those years. And honestly, I think that, like, Bill Maher recently came out and talked some shit about Stan Lee, basically saying, hey, some guy who made a bunch of comic books died. Who cares about that? What does that mean? What does that matter in the grand scheme of things? Shouldn't we be talking about things that matter, not stupid superheroes, that kind of shit? Which, if you ever followed Bill Maher, he hates all that that shit. He hates all fan shit. He hates Star Wars, Star Trek, Harry Potter.
He just sounds
comic
like a
books,
bitter cunt.
Superheroes. No, he's a guy who's really into politics, and he thinks it's a bunch of fantasy bullshit. Not realizing that he's a millionaire who he doesn't have a kid, he doesn't have a wife, he smokes pot all the time and talks about that all the time, and he thinks that puts him like that's not immature to live the kind of lifestyle he's got. But we don't all have millions of dollars, and we all work a fucking real job, and we come back from our jobs, we're tired and we're dispirited, and then we enjoy our escapist fantasies, which may seem adolescent, but I think it's more of a primal thing. People enjoy power fantasies, people enjoy the soap opera that Stanley introduced into the comic books, and we don't all get to fuck off and be millionaires like Bill Maher does, okay? But what Bill Maher fails to understand is that Stanley also helped to promote liberalism. I mean, you had, obviously, you had the movements in the 60s, all the social movements, all the hippies and all that kind of good stuff. But comic books penetrated a conservative stronghold. Comic books got into the hands of kids, and those comic books showed black people as superheroes. Those comic books showed civic responsibility. They showed all these things that are great liberal ideas. Stanley was a liberal. Most of the guys working at Marvel were liberals, except for Steve Ditko for the most part. And Marvel comics were full of liberal values that were not present at DC. I've beat this drum a bunch of times. I don't think so much in the podcast, but in blogs and shit like that. DC was a conservative company. Fucking Jack Leibowitz was the son of a union head, right? This is a guy who his dad spent all these years building up unions at a time when they would fucking get guys out with fucking cudgels and bats and fucking beat you bloody for being part of a union. This guy spent his whole life fighting for unions, fighting for workers' rights, and then Jack Leibowitz completely fucking betrays that shit. Is one of the big strong men of the comic book industry that fucking strong arms people, that fucking ripped off guys like Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. And whereas Siegel and Shuster, when they were doing Superman comics, had humanist values, had liberal values in Superman character, once they started pulling the character away from its creators, became much more about the status quo, about supporting, the societies it was, even some capitalist values in there. DC was a very conservative company. Batman and Robin, what are they doing? They're chasing after bank robbers and shit. When Superman first came out, he was going after wife beaters. He was going after war profiteers. He literally went into fascist Italy and Germany and scooped up the leaders of those countries and took them to a world court in a time. I think it was Time magazine. It was like a 2 or 3 page story where Superman did that. That shit went out the window once those guys were gone. And Superman was all about support your police, buy war bonds, all that kind of bullshit. It became a total tool of the status quo. DC was always a very conservative company. DC did not like people of color. They did not feature them in their comics. At best, they'd be background characters. DC Comics did not promote the actual creators of the comics. The creators of the comics were DC Comics. There were no human beings involved with the production of this stuff. And then Stan comes along and he realizes 2 things. One, it's just there's a moral duty to show that these creators are working on these comics. But more importantly, 2, Stan realized that if you promote the creators, people plug into those creators like they're baseball players. You become a fan of Jack. You become a fan of Steve. You became a fan of Joe Maneely. And Stan Lee was the biggest fan of Joe Maneely before he died in a subway accident. So you create stars. A subway accident.
Oh.
No, the subway. I get you now. He was drunk and he fell between 2 subway cars and got run over.
Oh, well, that happens.
Yeah. He realized that he could make stars out of the artists, and that connected the readers more to the comics and to the creators, and so it was a sales tool as well. But the fact is, before Stan, you didn't have creator credits in comic books. And when you had creator credits, suddenly creators had more power. They had more bargaining power. They could make more money. They created an audience for themselves, which passed into the conventions and stuff. I think that Stanley instilled a liberal, moral, and center in a lot of people that wouldn't have had that otherwise. I think that Stan introduced people to different political stripes in general because DC Comics were very apolitical, especially in the 50s and 60s. And so Stan Lee contributed to a social revolution. You don't have people that love a guy like Stan Lee so much if he doesn't have a major cultural imprint, certainly a bigger imprint than Bill Maher's sorry fucking ass ever going to have. And it happens because he instilled that in people from an early age. He instilled it for generations of people around the world, especially Americans. Even if you didn't read Stan Lee comics in the 60s and 70s, then you watched a cartoon show of the Incredible Hulk or Spider-Man that Stan Lee's narrating. Or in the 90s, you're watching his video series, or you're seeing him show up in Mallrats. He was an ambassador for comics. He was a guy who showed up in the mass media. Whoever would have him, wherever he would have him, because he was so charismatic and such a great salesman, he would make you like him, make you want to hear his stories, and ingratiate yourself to him. And all these people fucking loved him, and that paid off the comic book industry. Without Stan, nobody knows who Jack Kirby is to support him when he's going up against Marvel. You know? So even if you poo-poo Stan Lee, even if you think that he did too much of a credit grab, well, he certainly showed more remorse about that than Bob fucking Kane ever did. You know, he certainly did it later in life. And by later in life, I'm talking about 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Stan still was giving more credit. He was like, okay, maybe I took too much credit. Let me talk more about the other guys that worked in these books. So he spent more years than a lot of the people who would criticize Stan Lee have been alive, telling people, no, wait, Jack was there, Steve was there, Marie Severin was there, all these other people were there too. It wasn't just me. So can he get a little forgiveness for that? You know, maybe he did oversell his role as a creator of Marvel, but he was also selling Marvel and Marvel's talent, and he deserves credit for that as well.
And he also never left, right?
Right.
I mean, he never left.
He left-ish, but he dabbled in other things, but he never really left. So he never betrayed Marvel the way Jack and Steve supposedly did.
There was never Stan Lee's New Gods over at DC. You know what I mean? Was there? Am I forgetting?
Just imagine if Stan Lee created Superman, Batman, and all that.
Is there?
But that was a little stunt thing. That wasn't. Yeah, it wasn't like
that's a stunt.
I'm leaving and I'm never coming back. It's like no, he's finally getting to dabble a little bit. That's all that was.
No, that kind of a project is done because that's like the exception that proves the rule. He's doing it because let's see the guy who would never come over and do DC. Like that's
all he ever did was this little 7-book project, 5-book project that it was, and he was gone again. So yeah, it's like Mark Bagley when he went to DC and he did like 1 year-long miniseries and a few special projects, and he's right back at Marvel. That was a blip. Where when Jack left, Jack never truly came back to Marvel. He came back a little bit. He did a few projects, but that was more dabbling, than actual a return.
Yeah, and I mean, and that's it. That's as soon as somebody says, "Oh, Stan Lee, the Marvel guy," and then you've always got the people who are like, "Well, he didn't give so and so credit. Oh, he just put his name on all that stuff." And you're right. I mean, I remember him being remorseful about that stuff forever. So at what point do we come on? Let's lay off, dude. Give me a break. Anyway.
Yeah. And again, being Mr. Marvel really got his name out there, and a lot of artists resented that, but they weren't going to be out there.
Right.
They weren't doing it. Jack wasn't out there fucking glad-handing people, And I'm not diminishing Jack Kirby's talent. You don't have a Stan Lee without a Jack Kirby or Steve Ditko but you needed more than just Jack. You needed more than just Steve. It was kind of like the Beatles. The Beatles were always more as a group than they were for the sum of the parts. It was about getting all those guys in the same room and creating. That's what created the greatest band of all time. It wasn't just John Lennon. If it had been just John Lennon, he probably would have. I don't know that he would have ever done anything. I don't know that we would have ever spoken John Lennon's name if he were not a member of the Beatles. You need all those guys together to create the specific alchemy that created Marvel comic books. And you can't diminish Stan Lee's talent either, because as great of an artist as Jack Kirby was, as much of a conceptualist as he was, as soon as he starts putting dialogue in characters' mouths, people lose interest. That's why when The King moved over to DC and did New Gods, there were a lot of people anticipating that. And when it actually came out, the book actually came out, there were definitely hardcore followers. You don't get Jim Starlin doesn't happen without Jack Kirby and the New Gods necessarily, But for every guy that loved New Gods, there were 5 guys that couldn't stand it because the writing wasn't there. The writing wasn't what they wanted it to be because nobody could write like Stan Lee. And the reason why is because Stan Lee wrote everything that Proto-Marvel produced. He wrote funny animals. He wrote adventure. He wrote war. He wrote western. He wrote teen comedy. He wrote all this stuff, and all the skills that he developed doing all those different genres got plugged into the superhero comics, the soap opera. It all got plugged in that one place. Marvel doesn't happen without that one guy having to write everything because there's nobody else to write all that shit. Because he's bringing all these tools, all these influences, all of this everything he had to bear into those comics, and there wasn't ever another writer that did that. Maybe like a Joe Gill or maybe Paul Norris. There are a few guys that maybe did that amount of genres, but none of them ever synthesized it into that perfect comic book story the way Stan Lee was able to do with his dialogue. So if you don't think that Stan Lee is an equal to Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, you're fucking fooling yourself. Very much so. Because it's just simple math. Look at what Stan and Steve and Jack did together versus what they did separately. Stan Lee gave us Nightcat. Steve Ditko gave us Speedball. Jack Kirby gave us Machine Man. It's like, it's not the same fucking thing. You needed them all to make it work. but you can't diminish that Stan Lee was at least an equal partner in all that. Even if he didn't come up with the plot, even if he was just doing the dialogue, it was enough because there was so much in the dialogue that wasn't on the page. It was still enough. It still was an equal partner in the creation of Marvel Comics.
Yeah, I mean, I want to say, so like when comic book, I've been out of comics for a while. Although the podcast has sort of kind of got me back into comics, I can't really say that anymore.
Well, I would say you still had an interest in the industry because you still read stuff about the industry without reading actual comic books.
But every year, whenever I see another creator has passed away, when John Buscema passed, that got me.
Rough way to die too. He had the stomach cancer, right?
I believe so. John Buscema was my guy. And when I got the Stan news, I would say the Stan news was only hampered by the fact that he's quote unquote died a fucking half dozen times over the last 5 years, because every year there's a hoax that comes out that he's passed away.
Well, not just that, but he'll cancel a stream of a convention appearances.
His health will go south. You think, oh well, this is it for Stan, and then he's back out. He's back out at another con a few weeks later. You're like, what the fuck? So I was probably a little more prepared for Stan, but I was still, for somebody who was 95 and has had so many health issues, I was still kind of like, oh, not Stan.
Yeah.
Like you were hoping the dude would just live forever,
right? Or make it to 100,
or just exactly.
Well, I think the death of Joni took a real toll on him because it was only in the last year and a half, and I think she passed a couple of years ago, that he really seemed to not. He failed to thrive.
Yeah, and I, as much, and Bill Maher was making a big deal about all the celebrities who were like, oh, Stan or whatever. But I mean, I like the Avengers cast posting up. I think that was like legit. I think they legit were like,
because they actually met the dude.
When Stan came in a room, like, we're celebrities. And when Stan came in a room, you were like, whoa, like this dude he's just got a gravity about him. And who was it that was, oh my God, I'm totally forgetting who did the interview and said that, it was Hugh Jackman. Hugh Jackman was at one of the Comic-Cons, and he was like, I was walking around like I was big shit. I'm Wolverine, and I'm out there, and he was like, I was on the red carpet, and there was nobody around me. And I realized it was because every single person was around Stan Lee. Stan Lee was at the other end of the red carpet, and everybody left Wolverine to go stand around Stan Lee. And he goes, I'm Hugh Jackman. I'm an actor. I'm Wolverine, and nobody's paying attention to me because Stan is there. and that's the kind of thing. Like you're right. I mean, look. So yeah, maybe some people are upset that Stan hogged the spotlight, but were you going to take the spotlight if Stan wasn't there, or was it just going to be empty? Was there just going to not be anybody in the spotlight? And I think more often than not, that's the case. I think that they're just. He was just a really unique personality to be able to take that spotlight and then not just take it, but like it's like it sees it, like, and demand you pay attention to him. And then when you start paying attention to him, you can't like look away. Like when Stan's talking, you can't look away.
Magnetism.
It's incredible. And so and not
just that, there are all these stories too about acts of kindness. Like, a line was getting closed, and there was a kid, that wanted to get in there, and he brings a kid in, or the kid gets something signed for free. He was always doing stuff for people, especially for kids. He always wanted to take care of those young fans, or just in general, just moments where he took time to just spend a little time with somebody where they're not paying him. There was a sense of, oh yeah, you're going to pay $200 get a signature from Stan Lee, but you didn't necessarily have to have that happen. It's like you two over here, right? You guys went and saw Stan Lee at Comicpalooza one year. You didn't have any money. You didn't want to spend any money. But it was a lull in Stan's line, and you guys walked up, and you just wanted to shake his hand and thank him for the work that he did. And he didn't shake hands because he was an old guy. He's getting sick all the time.
He had pens that he was signing with between his fingers, because I guess he couldn't hold the pens anymore.
No, I'm pretty sure he was giving dap because he was not shaking hands.
He shook that girl's hand behind us.
Well, so Stan shook a girl's hand. That's fine.
She reached down and he took a little extra time with that girl. I remember that.
After we got through the line, I watched. He was dapping everybody up. He's old. You probably shouldn't be shaking people's hands when you're.
Shaking hands is one of the worst things you can do, especially if you're compromised.
When you're in your early 90s and you have hundreds of people lined up.
Well, was he in his 90s by that point? It's been a few years since then.
No, but it wasn't 5 years ago. He was probably 92.
Are you sure?
No, about 2-3 years ago.
Okay.
Yeah, it was probably 3 years.
Yeah, it wasn't that long ago.
He was probably 92.
Well, and you got that picture of him on the golf cart too, or getting on that golf cart.
Was that me or was that you?
Was that you that got the picture?
No, it wasn't me.
So one of you two got a picture of him hopping on the back of the golf cart.
Anyway, the dap was. He was dapping everybody up on banging knuckles because you don't touch hands with other humans. But anyway, what were you saying? But
you guys got to go up there and give Stan Lee a dap, get daps from Stan. You guys paid nothing for that.
Yeah, I got to admit too, he smiled the entire time we were waiting in line. I never once saw him.
You could tell he genuinely enjoyed the human contact. He enjoyed the attention, and he enjoyed the conversation. So you don't get that from just anybody.
Yeah.
So-
I think, he actually, because for me, growing up, comics, Stan Lee was the face of comics. Like, I remember
Stan Lee Presents.
watching the cartoons and, True Believers, he would do the Spider-Man or the Hulk. Like, if you heard Stan, you knew.
Nuff said Excelsior.
Yeah. For me as a child, that Stan Lee was the face of comics. I couldn't, if you were to ask me who's a comic book person, I wouldn't be able to name one, but I knew Stan Lee. I knew from his face, I knew from his voice, from his appearances in cartoons. So for me, he was the face of comics. Like, I don't think we would be where we are today without him. I don't think Hollywood would have paid as much attention.
But I think that's. I mean, think about it. Excelsior, Nuff said, True Believers, characters he didn't write said those things. Stan Lee said those things. Like,
he became a character in his own book.
We're not talking about it's clobbering time. It's a human being that says these things, and it's just, Excelsior. Oh, that's Stan Lee. Nuff said that's Stan. We're talking about a guy. He's not a character. He's not a fictional character. I mean, he almost kind of is.
He is now in the Marvel universe.
Yeah, but you know what I mean? He's such a personality that we know these phrases of his, and he's not even. It's not like he's a character in a show. He's a guy who just. When you just think about it, I think we kind of take it for granted. It's like, oh, Nuff said. You don't realize this is just a guy. He's not an actor. He's not in movies. This is just a dude, and we know his catchphrases.
Right?
How do we know his catchphrases? Is he in a weekly TV show? No.
He was. He was in my comic books every week.
Right.
That I went to the shop to pick up books. Stan was somewhere in that book, always.
But that's what I'm saying, though. He's not Spider-Man. He's not the Thing. He's not, you know what I mean? He's not Flame On.
Most celebrities are lucky if they get one stinking catchphrase that you can associate with them. What you talking about, Willis? Where's the beef? Stan had a whole fucking gaggle of those things, and you recognize his imprint on all of them.
Yeah.
And he never did anything. He wasn't. He's in movies now, but everybody could name those catchphrases long before he started doing all these cameos.
Oh yeah.
People forget he started doing cameos. I think Mallrats was the first thing he cameoed in as for an actual motion picture. As an actual motion picture, not documentaries and shit. Not Staber videos, series about the comic book greats or any bullshit like that. I'm talking about actually appearing in real movies that real people saw. I looked at his IMDb. I think it starts with Mallrats, and a few years later he starts doing the Marvel movies. I think he was in X-Men. He was in Fantastic Four. He was in Spider-Man.
He didn't do any of the early Marvel movies?
Spider-Man, X-Men.
No, I'm talking early, like 80s.
No, he might have been. I think he was a juror in one of the Hulk TV movies.
I was going to say, because I remember seeing him, because I remember they made a big deal, and Stan Lee. I remember seeing him in one of those.
Yeah. But not like actual big budget, like motion pictures and stuff.
More than 15 people see it, kind of.
Or something that people paid to see, not something.
Mallrats, let's say, maybe 15 people saw that one.
Mallrats, but he had a whole.
I love the movie, but I went to the theater to go see it, and there was like 4 people in the theater with me.
It's got to be a kind of a cult classic.
Yeah.
I'm not a fan of Mallrats. I'm just saying he actually got a whole scene in Mallrats.
Well, his scene is famous where they're asking about,
Things Ding.
Dick. Yeah, it's hilarious.
Point being, though, is his first movie's in '96. And people already knew all the catchphrases just from comics, just from Stan being Stan. So that's a rare cultural imprint just right there.
So, but it's like you said, to people who hated that he hogged the spotlight.
Where were you?
What was your Excelsior? You got one? What are you going to just make one? No, you probably wouldn't. So let's chill out. I think that he did far more good than bad. Like
absolutely.
Said, he's got a complicated legacy, and and again the litigation around the dude's estate is going to be sickening.
Yeah.
And I'm sure we're going to find out some just horrible thing. You know what I mean? But outside of that, give me a break. I mean, if you don't think Stan was good for comic books, you were super bitter about something personal, right? I mean, or just what does the kids say? A hater? Maybe you're just a hater. Maybe you're just a creepy Batman fan who can't stand that a Marvel guy gets run. I don't know.
There's that. Oh, well, also, if you're Jack Kirby and Stan Lee spends the entirety of the 60s telling you you're going to have a stake in Marvel and that you're generating, God, how many pages of work did Jack Kirby produce for Marvel in the span of years in the 1960s, with the promise that he was eventually going to get the payment for that he was eventually going to have the stake in the company. And he does this from, 60-something, right up through 68 when he leaves because they kept promising and never fucking delivering. And Stan Lee never had a stake in the company. He got promoted in the company, but he never had a stake in that company ever. And he created Marvel,
Yeah.
So if you're Jack and Roz Kirby and you want to hate Stan Lee, you've got every fucking right to hate Stan Lee. If you're Steve Ditko and you feel like Stan Lee hijacked your character and turned it into something that you despise, Steve Ditko has every right in the world to hate Stan Lee. And I guess if you're a hardcore fan of one of these Marvel creators who got burned, okay, sure, you're allowed to hate Stan Lee. But if you're just like objectively looking at it and going, well, he took too much credit. Well, yeah, all these guys did something fucked up. And if they didn't do something fucked up, they didn't do something. Because there are tons of people who create some comic books and that's all they do, and then they go off and they die. Stan Lee created, sustained the comic book industry, made an imprint on the morals of people around the world through those comics, and gave the blueprint for the comic book movies that are dominating Hollywood and continuing to give a moral, true north to the cultures of the world. Because think about it. In the 80s up through the 90s, think about how many amoral cop movies you saw. Where it's like dirty cops or renegade cops. They're shooting all these people and everybody's fucking dying. And the only moral is, oh, you're doing drugs, you're a bad guy. Bang, bang, pow, pow. As simplistic as superhero movies are, you can't tell me that Captain America and Iron Man and Thor and Hulk aren't better role models than fucking John Rambo. You know, give me a fucking break. You know, so many of our cultural heroes for decades were these morally ambiguous figures, these extremely violent figures. Yeah, it's lame that Marvel superheroes have all these bloodless battles with aliens and shit. But don't you think that's better for kids than, you know, war shit and bad cop shit and all this gunplay and shit? Don't you want to see a kid with a sword, or, I mean, not a sword, with a shield or repulsor ray instead of a fucking AR-15, you know? So don't fucking tell me that this doesn't make a difference. It may be super commercialized. It may come across as crass. But it's a lot better than what we came up with, you know? I grew up with, if I didn't have superheroes, I'd be growing up with like a lot of these other guys that fucking worship the gun. And look at what the fuck that's done to our country. Well, with the exception of the Punisher, pretty much none of the Marvel heroes are running around with guns. That's already a fucking improvement. That's already better for our culture than your fucking, kind of shit that Bill Maher probably wants to fucking watch. So don't tell me that Stan and Marvel didn't have a positive impact. And
yeah, you know, and I saw a lot of people who were drawing the comparison to Stan being essentially, I mean, what's the difference between Stan and Walt Disney? You know, Walt Disney.
Stan was a far better person than Walt Disney.
No, I'm not talking about as a person.
But he wasn't a Nazi sympathizer for starters.
No, shit, that's not what
he
I'm talking about.
He wasn't a union breaker.
When you think about people who the foundation of our imaginations as Americans,
right?
Like Walt Disney built cartoons. Like cartoons don't exist without Walt Disney in their current form, right? He revolutionized even theme parks.
Not just that, but manga. You know, I was explaining to Paquita that all the early manga, starting with Astro Boy, was a descendant of Walt Disney. They saw the Walt Disney early cartoons, the black and whites, and loved them, and manga sprang from that shit. So Disney kind of gets partial credit for manga even.
Right. So I think when you're building this Mount Rushmore of American pop culture heroes, I mean, Walt and Stan are, when you look at everything what they created, quote unquote, influenced, you know, people make I think it's maybe a bit of a cliche now, but people go, you know, they talk about how superheroes are like, they're our, you know, mythology, right?
Yeah.
They're our Hercules, true. Literally. You know, that's our pantheon of gods that you use to tell morals. You know, so you tell these stories and things like that. And I think that I don't think that that's really that far off. I mean, especially now with the movies going so crazy. And I think that, I don't know, I feel like it, with Stan passing, maybe it's giving me a little bit of hope that, you know, there is some due given to these characters. But I do think that there is a little bit of at least it let people back off the comic book hate because the movies are so popular and they're just churning out these comic book movies. There is a lot of comic movie hate. So I think Stan passing is, let people go, well, okay, yeah, sure, the movies are getting a little annoying, but let's not forget what Stan did and what, you know what I mean. We still love these characters, and they wouldn't be what they are without Stan. And so I think that's been refreshing for me, because comic hate's been a little low hanging fruit.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
You know, anyway.
By the way, I was wanting to ask you guys about this too. The Mount Rushmore of Marvel comic, which is going to kind of derail us a little bit if you don't, bear with me. But I was thinking about that. Obviously, Stan Lee, obviously Jack Kirby, obviously Steve Ditko, because I keep name dropping these guys as we've been talking. But who's the fourth guy?
Fucking George Tuska. John Romita?
Joe Kubert? Joe Kubert?
No,
not Joe Kubert.
Kidding me?
He worked a little for Marvel, but like Epic and
his
stuff.
His kids worked for Marvel way
Yeah,
more
his kids worked for Marvel, yeah. Joe Kubert is really associated with DC, so it's like...
That's right, Sergeant Rock and all that shit.
Yeah,
that's
Hawkman.
Right. That's right. For some reason, I was thinking Sergeant Rock was Marvel, but it's not.
Hey, how about this one? You ready? Joe Quesada?
No.
Hadn't earned it yet.
No, you don't think think he's led the company
he
for
was
quite
a
a
great
long
editor
time
in
now?
chief, but no.
Really?
Jim Shooter?
No.
An argument could be made.
Now get out of here.
You don't think
Shooter,
so?
I could.
No, he didn't create enough stuff, right? He just shepherded.
Creative Transformers, damn it.
Roy Thomas, the guy who saved Marvel through licensing Conan and Star Wars. But the fact is, because there were licenses, it's hard to give full credit for that.
I think I could do reverse Mount Rushmore. Bob Harris, Tom DeFalco, like all the people who.
Well, you keep going for editors in chief, though.
Like, I mean, I'm talking about bad. I'm talking about, on the.
Oh, okay. Like going up the
ruined Marvel comic. Shout out Bob Harris. Let me see.
I'm still thinking Jim Shooter. I
think Jim Shooter was
did
a great
a lot of
steward
stuff
of Marvel in the
late 70s,
I would
early
say
80s.
John Byrne before Jim Shooter.
John Byrne? Okay, John Byrne. Now we're getting somewhere, I think. John Byrne definitely.
But did he steer Marvel?
He didn't steer the whole of Marvel, but did he create
every damn book? Fantastic.
Jim Shooter
He's got a
steered
Fantastic Four run. He's got an X-Men run.
Because of him, we got fucking Secret Wars and shit.
Right, but here's the argument.
The birth of the fucking miniseries.
Understood, but what did Jim Shooter create that was on a level of what Stan and
The
Jack and
miniseries.
Steve did? No,
The
but
fucking
like
10
concepts.
The blending of fucking toys and movies and comics, like to create stories for toys to move the products. They didn't just stay in one medium. He was able to move into a different medium completely.
Well, that kind of paints him as a salesman, though. So
like Stan, just like Stan.
Okay.
He sold Marvel to a new generation of kids who maybe didn't pick up a comic book, but they picked up toys, and maybe will come over to the comics because of the toys they played with.
Okay. And you were talking about John Byrne. Do you think John Byrne, in terms of the things he created, because while he sustained the creations of particularly of Stan and Jack, did he create anything at Marvel that was sustained that elevated the company? And
I'm not really sure when I think of the X-Mania, which carried Marvel through the 90s, I just feel like John Byrne was such a huge part of that. I can't.
But he didn't create most of those characters.
know he didn't.
Dave Cockrum designed a bunch of them.
Dave
well, the Constant's Chris Claremont,
and
though.
Chris Claremont, right?
So I mean, is Claremont on there then?
I don't know.
When you're bringing these names up to me, I'm thinking of people who moved the company, not someone who just wrote comics or just drew them. That actually moved the medium in a different direction.
It's comic books, so.
But they moved the medium in a different direction.
Only drew, but he created characters,
and they took his drawings and they made toys and they made all kinds of shit out of it. Stan sold it to the public to.
But he also co-created the characters and wrote the characters, and developed them. So he was a creative person as well. So that's my big thing. Is like,
but he brought normies into this world.
Right.
He was their gateway drug to get in there.
But they wouldn't have come if the stories weren't there.
True.
So you still had to have the creative, and he was a creative as well. That's one of the problems with
that's why I'm arguing really strong for Shooter.
But the thing in terms of creative, though, what did he create?
Shooter wrote stuff.
What did he write? Like if you're talking about a Mount Rushmore of Valiant comics, 100% Jim Shooter is like the face. He's George Washington. But what did he create at Marvel that was sustaining? That was something that made the company, took it to the next level, or made it more bedrock that they were the king of comics, That's the tricky part. I think Claremont might be the best shot at that because Claremont wrote 16 years of X-Men when they were the number one comic book in all the world, when new people were being brought into comics specifically for X-Men. He did co-create a whole shit ton of those X-Men. The ones he didn't create, that Len Wein and Dave Cockrum came up with, and John Romita, because John Romita designed Wolverine. But they didn't stay around long enough to actually develop them the way that he did. So.
But all you keep saying is X-Men.
Well, no,
all the other guys,
that's the big.
But the other guys, you had Spider-Mans, you had Hulks, you had
but
the other creators
that's
had
covered
multiple.
by Jack Kirby, Stan Lee, and Steve Ditko.
But they created different characters.
Leave the X-Men off. I mean, the X-Men are decades of the reason why this company continued.
But Jack and Stan came up with the original X-Men.
Yeah.
I
so that's why it's like it kind of.
But they weren't king shit. They weren't king shit.
Yeah.
At the time, that was still when they created the X-Men. It was still Fantastic Four, Spider-Man.
Well, is there something besides the X-Men or X-Men derivatives? Because, let's say, one of the big things right now is Deadpool, right? But do you think that Deadpool actually sustains Marvel? Does it elevate Marvel to another level? The way that the creations of the other three guys did. Is there any other creators that their faces they're just
fucking
undeniable?
Bendis? Fucking Bendis.
Fucking Bendis. There's another traitor for you. If you want to point to a traitor, there's fucking one right there. That you didn't have to suffer through his Avengers all those years. Oh my God, I want you to have to read Bendis Avengers just to see how much you would hate it.
George Perez.
I want you to hate fuck Bendis Avengers.
George Perez is too.
And Perez is so associated with
DC.
too.
Yeah, he's very DC.
He had a great runs in Marvel, but he didn't create anything in Marvel the way he did at DC.
Let me see who else. I mean, my guy John Buscema.
And I think there's because Buscema definitely was the replacement Jack.
Yeah.
Because everything that Jack used to do, Buscema did a run on and sustained. So I think that argument can definitely be made. Barry Smith, Jim Starlin.
I like John Romita Jr. I think John Romita Jr. could be.
I was going to say Starlin, but he had like just a small footprint.
Yeah. Starlin had an impact, but he feels
$2 billion movie too.
Yeah. Oh, okay. And here's one more thing too. Stan Lee's cameos.
Maybe it's one of the movie guys. What's his name?
Feige.
Yeah, Kevin
Argument
Feige.
could be made. Argument could very much be made for Feige. Yeah. Certainly he took Marvel to the next level, and we've seen other people try to be Feige, and
it's never worked.
Yeah, you without Feige, I don't think it works. So a very strong argument there for Feige. Yeah. How many Stan Lee cameos do we have left?
I think they filmed 5.
How much are you gonna?
I heard 2.
How much are you gonna get choked up when he shows up in Avengers 4?
Hopefully I haven't walked out before.
I'm just glad he wasn't part of the snap. That would have killed him.
That meme popped up immediately, by the way.
Really?
The snap, and you've got a picture of Stan dissolved.
Just fading away. Oh, that's rough.
That's rough.
No, somebody tells me Stan would have got a kick out of that.
Yeah.
That's what.
Yeah, I know he would have.
Here's the big one, though. Once those ones that he's filmed have been used up, are we okay with Stan continuing in CGI? Do we want? Do we think that Stan would want that? I think he would, actually. This is one instance where I seriously think that Stan would be perfectly happy
that
to be
seems
CGI.
like the most Stan Lee fucking thing ever, though, doesn't it?
What's that?
To keep me around as a CGI automaton,
right?
Hologram.
I think you'd fucking love that shit.
Yeah, I think I see a lot of these CGI automatons, and I'm like, ooh, I bet they would not have been cool with that.
Mm-hmm.
And Stan would be like, sign me up.
Dude, he probably
write the checks to Stan Lee.
He probably did.
I'll
did
sign
the
contract
alphabet
in my own blood.
No, he did the alphabet already. They have it pre-recorded, every word he could think of.
Oh,
a Stanley emulator.
Yeah, basically just.
I can't wait for he and Tupac. He and Tupac are going to be like a buddy cop movie.
Oh, hey, they get
CGI Tupac,
hologram Stanley at SDCC. Yeah, totally.
I would dap hologram Stan Lee.
So are we okay with him continuing then? If they decide to get somebody to do the voice and just keep having CGI?
Oh no, dude, they don't need to do the voice. I'm sure they can piece together. Stan's been around for a very long time.
It'd be like Max Headroom or something.
Yeah, that'd be kind of weird. Yeah, the voice is a little weird.
True believers.
Well, okay, and here's another thing too. If they do CGI Stan, what do they got the Jack Kirby estate to sign off on him showing up? How far can we take
Freddy
this?
versus Jason?
That's wrong, dude. But how far can we take this though?
I got a question for you. Earlier you were talking about Jack being like this kind, grandfatherly type guy.
He also really gruff.
Yeah, I remember hearing stories where like he was an asshole. Like you would go to his house and he would have like.
Wait, who are we talking about here? Stan or Jack?
Jack Kirby.
That he would have like a page from Fantastic Four #2, and he was using the piece of art to hold his Sharpie knives and shit. Like he was stabbing artwork.
That wasn't Jack. That was Steve Ditko.
Was that Steve Ditko?
I heard all those stories about using comic book pages and cutting boards and shit. Those are all Steve Ditko.
Someone had told me it was Jack Kirby. I was thinking, well, that's going to
Jack Kirby couldn't because he didn't have any of his original art. I mean, he was suing to try to get. Yeah, he was in the early '80s. He was suing to get his original.
So then I was told wrong. I remember someone told me.
Hold on, but this is the important part. After fighting for most of the '80s to get the original art back, when Marvel finally turned it back over to him, it was a tiny fraction of what he'd actually produced because everything else had been stolen by their freelancers and by guests who showed up there. Yeah. They gave his shit away or had it stolen and rather give it back to him.
There was an article written in the last couple of years about this weird black market around Jack Kirby artwork.
Yeah, generally, because if you buy a page of Jack Kirby artwork, it's almost certainly stolen.
It's like almost completely positive that it's stolen and has been stolen from Jack Kirby's estate via the Marvel offices. And so there's this weird black market around Jack Kirby original artwork. It's super fast. It's sad, but it's super like kind of fascinating and
there's like a subculture.
American greed shit.
Yeah, like they communicate wink wink.
Well, not just that, but there was also a time too where Marvel. I think most of the publishers would destroy original artwork, and so a lot of times freelancers were actually saving quote unquote the artwork from getting destroyed or liberating it where it would otherwise have just stayed in their libraries. So that could be justification of thieving ass nerds, that happen to get pro access.
I remember reading an article where they were talking about they had interviewed this woman who worked in, I want to say the Marvel offices, but it might have been DC. And she would talk about how like they would tell her, hey, can you go clean out the files? And she would just stack artwork and go into the dumpster in the back and just throw it away like nothing. And the guy was asking her, like, do you remember anything? She's like, I remember a lot of covers. And she would talk about like covers she saw. And you kind of got a feeling like some of this might have gone home with her. Like she was like, oh, this is cool. Let me take it to my son type shit. But I remember reading that and I was like, wow, that's kind of neat to think that they saw no value in this whatsoever.
But in my opinion, that's what makes a true collectible. That's
scarcity.
You talk about
scarcity
the 90s
created by neglect.
The 90s where you're creating collectibles.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with like the quickest way to know that a viral video is fake is when it calls itself a viral video. It's this. I was like, if it says viral video, just 100% of the time it's fake. Hit Snopes immediately, right? But it's the same way when you're trying to create limited edition baseball cards by we're putting one in every 100 boxes, and you're trying to create the market. That's the quickest way to watch the market burn out and crash.
Well, it's just like these guys who are selling the first appearance of Deadpool for hundreds of dollars. He slabbed and shit. It's like, bitch, New Mutants number 98. There was at least 250,000 copies floating around of that shit. Probably more. I think it was probably closer to 500,000. Within the last decade, I was at a comic shop that had like a half a long box full of those things for $1 a piece. And not even bagged and boarded. They were just dumped in there.
I have one.
Yeah, and I'm sure I don't have one currently.
I do. I own one, and it's bagged and boarded from the day I bought it. It looks great. I wouldn't sell it for $100.
Sadly, I didn't buy that for $1, so that'd been nice.
I'd buy that for $1.
But yeah, don't try to fucking tell me that's scarce when there's like Basic Fantasy number 15. You've got less than 15 copies in mint condition or less, or remotely. I don't think there's any. There may not be any mint copies. There might be just like very fines or something out there. So yeah, don't tell me that's comparable.
That was a break right there.
I was going to say something, but now I'm not going to because I don't remember it.
Yeah. So, are we okay with CGI, Stan?
I'm going to give that a no. I'm going to
pass
give it a no.
that.
But
I'm good to go.
You know what? And I don't want them to. You know what I would like? Maybe instead of Stan, you pick a creator. Let's have a Starlin.
That's hard. Those are some big shoes to fill. Big shoes.
I think he means like for one-offs. Like, let's do a Thor movie.
I've followed a lot of these guys on Twitter, and man, they just don't have the charisma that Stan had. They're
but a lot of these creators have kind of popped up in some. There have been creators in some of these that show up and
more so. Like the first Thor, Walt Simonson was in doing a crowd scene, a bunch of Asgardians around a table and stuff. But they've really kind of gotten away from that. We haven't seen Starlin in anything so far. For instance, I don't. So. Yeah, so if we're not cool with Stan, we're definitely not cool with anybody else.
I can't think of any. Like Joe Quesada's a nice guy, but I just don't.
But these movies do kind of feed on the Easter eggs.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, maybe you need to find something. But I think it would probably be better to not do it. I think you're right. If we don't have Stan, let's not do anybody.
Maybe like kind of let Avengers 4 be sort of an end of the era kind of thing, and yeah, maybe not even. I mean, maybe you stop with 4 too, even if they filmed a few. Maybe they just turn those into like DVD extras or something.
Nah, do one more.
Because you want him to have a good one to go out on, though, and certainly this would be like you don't want to see him in like a Ant-Man sequel. That's the last time he does a cameo.
Are we going to argue about what the best one was? Because it's over. It's Tony Stank from Civil War.
Oh no,
Tony Stank is the best one.
Guardians of the Galaxy when he's with the Watchers.
Don't at me.
Fuck you. That's the best one.
Tony Stank here. Tony Stank.
I love the one when he's like, "Wait, guys, I got more storage for you," and they're walking away like, "Jesus Christ, this guy never stops." I love that. I died laughing.
That's probably the most Stan.
Yeah, I died when I saw. I was dying loud. I thought it was hilarious because they're walking like, just keep going, go quick, and he's like, "Wait, aren't you my right?" I thought it was hilarious.
My favorite is still, "Oh man, I'm so fired." I always really enjoy that one.
Well, no, the Deadpool one.
It's probably my favorite Marvel.
The Deadpool one is pretty cute, though. So. I kind of like where he's at the strip bar, the DJ.
That one.
Yeah, that one was pretty cool. That's not where you expected Stan to be. Like, that was pretty good one too.
So worst. I'm leaning toward Black Panther.
I would say the first X-Men one with the water hose.
In the poker in the casino or whatever?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was dumb.
I thought the Black Panther one was really bad.
I thought the water hose one were the water. Oh, no, the Fantastic Four one where he's the mailman.
No, I love that. He was Willie Lumpkin. Yeah. Because that was back when there was a real novelty to it. You never, Stan hadn't done a lot of cameos. And so for him to show up and to be Willie Lumpkin.
Well, no, because he did Spider-Man. Did he do all 3 Spider-Mans or just one Spider-Man?
I didn't see the third one. I can't tell you.
I don't think he did the third. I don't think he did the second one.
He's in Homecoming. Homecoming.
Or the Sony one.
Wait, in the third one,
San Raimi.
In the third one, he played Peter Parker's classmate who was an emo and cut himself all the time, wasn't he? No, I'm joking. It's a joke.
I know he's an Amazing Spider-Man because that's when the lizard and them are fighting and he's listening to the music.
A story popped up on my thing that Sam Raimi didn't want Stan in the first Spider-Man or something like that. I didn't read the article.
Well, because then he gets rescued in the first one.
I don't care.
Is it like a big dick coat?
I know he was supposed to be in Black Panther, right? I mean, Blade. Wasn't this?
Yeah, he was cut. He was one of the cops who came in, but he got cut.
I remember I just saw that not too long ago.
Because there are a lot of like 60-some-odd-year-old, 70-year-old cops.
He could have been a detective.
Yeah, but the movie was supposed to be
cop.
No.
The movie was kind of trying to be serious. Probably not.
It would have kind of taken you out of it pretty early in the movies. Yeah.
I do like the one with Incredible Hulk where he and Luke
Ferrigno are both.
Yeah, they're walking. I was like, I thought that was pretty good. And the one where even the next Hulk one where he's the victim of the Hulk blood.
That was good. I like that one too. Yeah.
Man, this sucks.
Yeah, I'm gonna miss Stan.
Hey, everybody, so why don't you comment down below and tell us who's on your Mount Rushmore of Marvel Comics, but you have to have Jack, Stan, and Steve. So who's your fourth?
Who's your Ringo? Who's your Ringo? Who's your Ringo of the Marvels?
Hold on. You don't have to have Stan, Jack, and Steve. I want to see you guys.
Okay,
if
fair enough.
You want to go there.
No. You got to have Stan.
You have to. Dude, he's the bar.
No.
He's the bar.
You got to fucking... Okay, if you're going to fucking do this stuff, and if you're going to have the Stones to leave those three guys out, you got to fucking explain how the hell you're pulling that shit off.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Then they're going to do all the image guys. Jim Lee, Layfield.
Okay.
Todd,
just give me your validate. Tell me why.
Because they left Marvel, and Marvel almost collapsed under the weight of them leaving, and they created Image, which is now a third powerhouse.
It forced Marvel to evolve.
And they created the market.
Okay, you're doing their homework for them. Good job, guys. They're never going to learn if you do their homework for them.
Because that's too fucking easy.
For real, if you got Quesada and Feige on and you kicked somebody out, I wouldn't argue with you.
And if you say Bendis, we're going to find a way of blocking you from listening to our podcast.
100% not.
Or what's his name? Jimmy Palladio or whatever his fucking
Jimmy Palmiotti?
Yeah, his inker.
I like Jimmy Palmiotti.
A horrible writer.
He's not.
Horrible writer.
He's not.
Dude. I've read his Punisher shit. It was garbage.
Okay, I didn't wasn't aware that he wrote Punisher. But
I think he wrote like.
Are you sure?
Yeah, he did some Marvel stuff.
Okay, well, he's still written some stuff that's good.
They threw him a bone.
He's done some good stuff.
I guess I don't want to make it too complicated. Obviously, you could always break it up into 3 Mount Rushmores: one of writers, one of artists, one of executives. But then it gets
You're creating too many brackets. Fucking essay now.
Too many brackets now.
Don't Entertainment Weekly it. All right, just
no shit, dude.
Don't IGN list it or something.
Because now we're gonna be like the greatest, most powerful.
No, that's just a slideshow.
Everybody knows the most powerful is Stan Lee with Odin Force. This is our tribute to our man Stan the Manly. Thank you, Excelsior.
So I was actually hitting the rewind to go back to Amazing Fantasy 15.
Oh, right.
Okay.
But I think you ought to get him some help. He seems to be really hung up on superhero sex organs.
Excelsior! Oh.
Face front, true believers. Tonight we're all in the Merry Marvel Marching Society. 20th Century Geek, 108th Stage, Alley Bats, Amy Stewart Hale, Anime Freaks, Anime Nostalgia, Dr. Ange, Annie Torres, Ari and Al, BJ Mendelson, Bat/, Comics, Horror and Justice, Bill Shurdy, Brian Cunningham, Brody's Kitchen, CJ Fox, Caroline Wells, Checkered Past Podcast, Chocolate Coated Champion, Chris at Bad Books for Beginners, the Cinebud Podcast, Class 1000, a Marvel Superheroes Live RPG, Coffee and Comics, Collected Edition, Comic Book Dude 85, Daniel French, Responius, Sound Design, Darren and Ruth Sutherland, Doc Strange, Dirk Ashton, Ed Moore, Fair City Podcast, Fanholes Podcast, G.A. Sanchez, Gal Walks Into a Comic Shop, GCB 9222, Geek to Me Radio, Grave Girls Podcast, Green Lantern HG, Gregory Litchfield, The Hammer Strikes, Random Geeky Stuff, History of Comics on Film, The Hoopers, Ice in the Face, IG88, Jason Handelman, Jeffrey Brown, Jennifer DeRoss, Jerome B., Jerry Whitworth, Joe Kushner, John Horsley, Just in Time with the JNT Baggers, Justice First Dawn, Keith G. Baker, Kyle Benning Likes Comics, Ken Barr Jr., Leslie C. Gonzalez, The List Game, Longbox Crusade, Long Box of Darkness, Lost in Time, Man Brain Podcast, Marvel Mythos Podcast, The Marvel Vulture, Max Romero, Nathaniel Devon Sanford, The Nerd Grounds Jake, Nerdfic Strangers, Nerds Chatting, Movies, TV, Comics, Nexus of All, Nicole, Paul Matthew Carr, Randominable, Randy Caldwell, Rise Wortham, Richard Field, Richard G, Ryan Daly, Scott X, Sean Michael Ortega, Secret Wars and Beyond Podcast, Sean Merrick, Steve Sellers, Stockport Super, Stu Perrins, Tara Rose, Terry Mayo, Tim Price, Tiny Toy Robot Z, TJ Bax, Tony Scipione, Toy Lab, Trekker Talk, Viral Marketing Pros, Resurrections, a Warlock and Thanos podcast, Wonder Woman the Animated Series, Words and Pictures, Xenozoic Xenophiles, Yo Art, Zach Sally, and Xena Schultz. The Marvel Superheroes Podcast is in no way affiliated or endorsed by Marvel Entertainment. All characters mentioned and audio clips employed are believed covered under fair use, but remain copyright their respective copyright holders. But of course the views expressed are wholly owned by the people who spoke them. No infringement is intended.
Oh, how fucking rad! And I shared it on our Facebook page. The what card series was that from? With Stan's face?
Oh, that was Marvel Series 1. I think that was
Series
like
1 or is that Series 2? Series 2 was the...
No, it was Series 1 because it had the white border.
The white border.
Yeah,
that was
first Impel
one.
Series 91.
Always loved that trading card.
And I always was weirded out by that trading card.
I fucking love that card, dude. It is so unique. It is so different.
You want to
bizarre.
describe it in case people haven't seen that card?
Yeah, it's Stan's face, but each part of his face is a different Marvel character. I almost can't even freaking describe it. Like, you got a little bit of the Captain America A right on his forehead. He might have a wing, but it's Stan Lee's face. It's very bizarre. And I don't mean, it's bizarre. I'm not saying it's not bizarre.
Well, normally when you would see something like that,
striking.
there would actually be like lines to divide.
Yeah.
But in this one, it's like
blends or fades.
It's airbrushed.
Yeah.
And so everything's sort of integrated into one another, and there's no clear lines of demarcation. They all sort of meld into and fade into one another.
My question was, who's DC's Stan Lee?
Julie Schwartz would probably be the closest she got. And Julie... So here's the thing. One of the people that I saw tweeting out love for Stan Lee was Colleen Duran. And Colleen Duran was an early generation female fan that transitioned into being a professional. Although she's still most identified with independent work with books like A Distant Soil. But she came out of Legion fandom specifically. And so when she was transitioning from fan to pro, at one point she ends up in a taxi cab or limo or something with Julie Schwartz. And she was basically sexually harassed by Julie Schwartz. And although I don't think she's ever been able to identify him or has been disinclined to specifically identify him, but through context and inargued supposition, it came up that it's basically Julie Schwartz. And I don't know to what degree there was harassment. I don't know if there was touching or demands or propositions or what. But the point was that Colleen had grown up as a fan of comics, especially a fan of Legion comics. She's trying to get work with DC Comics, or is already working with DC Comics. Here's this revered, beloved editor who helped to usher in the Silver Age of comics. Essentially, he did usher in the Silver Age. And he is much older than her. She's like barely out of her teens, maybe even still in her teens. This guy by this point would have been in his 40s or 50s, probably more like his 50s, maybe even his 60s by that point. And he's coming on to her. And so it's like, that's a real marring of a legacy there, right? And she doesn't share that story until like the 2000s, well after he's gone. in a public sphere anyway. But when Stan dies, there's unequivocal love and affection, from her. So you see where you got one figure that's this iconic figure in comics, this incredibly important, influential figure, where she probably would have much greater reservations. Where with Stan, she's like, "Oh, we love Stan. Everybody loves Stan. We're gonna miss him so much." That says a lot, about who he was and how he treated people.
Yeah, I want to say I skimmed. Rob Liefeld did a piece on him too, and he said I think when he was like 16, Stan called him into his office, and he said he talked to him for hours, like hours. He was just talking to him about everything, about giving him advice, talking about and he was like, "This is Stan Lee." He was like, "I'm a 16-year-old kid," and he spent hours with, and he was like, he had no business doing that, and he just did it. And then, then the video series later, it was just, I don't know. He just seemed to, I don't know. It just seemed like he touched everybody in this.
And connected with them and gave them attention. As much as he obviously thrived on attention, he also gave attention in a very, generous way. And I think, too, if you watch early interviews with Rob Liefeld, like on the Dennis Miller show and stuff, you can see him really stammering and kind of seeming like he's kind of shy and struggling. The Spike Levi's videos, same thing, where he's struggling to kind of get his words out. But today, Rob Liefeld is one of the great ambassadors of comics. He doesn't produce a lot of comic books these days. He doesn't get shit done in the comic sphere necessarily. Aside from Hawk and Dove was like the last thing, which was 2011, where he was consistently getting out a book on a monthly basis. But as far as a guy who gets out there and does podcasts and I don't know about podcasts, but he does interviews and does YouTube videos and gets on DVD extras and is just out there promoting the industry and promoting adaptations like movies and TV shows. He and somebody who speaks, well, he's got such enthusiasm. He's such an energetic person. It almost feels like he's channeling Stan and maybe learned something from Stan in those hours, because I think he's doing his best to be the next, not the next Stan, but following in Stan's footsteps. Being the best person to represent for comics that he can be.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Whereas I think like, for instance, Todd kind of has a hard time doing that. I don't know, like Todd to me as out
Todd
there.
is more of a jack.
Yeah,
Todd will talk to you, but Todd can't articulate as well, and
he's very condescending.
He could use a bit more of a filter. And also Rob is a guy, even when he's being somewhat critical, he tries to put a spin on it to where it doesn't seem like it's harsh.
Totally.
He's just a overall really positive guy.
Or he won't talk about it.
Yeah. Where Todd's much more willing to go negative.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Nuff said,
Excelsior.
What would you like people to be left with from your career?
He wrote some good stories. I don't think about that much. When I'm gone, I really don't care. It doesn't do you any good when you're gone.